People think emotion is a weakness. We don't want to face our fears. We hide our trauma like the monster under our bed, and it is controlling every aspect of our life. We let that trauma control us, and we remain victims to the trauma. We let it control our lives. But I'm telling you, you can fight back. Get down, get in that monster's face and fight. It's gonna hurt. You're gonna get ripped apart, but guess what? You can get through it. And the more you fight it, the stronger you're gonna get. And one day you're gonna get out of your bed, your feet are gonna hit the floor, and that monster is gonna be like, oh man, they're up.
Domestic violence can lead to all sorts of effects on someone's life, whether that's psychological symptoms, difficulties functioning in different areas. All trauma, even if just witnessed, can cause those same trauma responses that we see when an individual is the direct victim of physical abuse or sexual abuse.
We now have a world full of traumatized people that are not functioning well. And what are we going to do about it? How are we going to change this so that next generation of people, we're not going to end up with a society full of people who are traumatized and lost and don't even know how to live.
We'll see children, very young children, who have been exposed to numerous acts of domestic violence that are almost unaffected by the violence. And you might hear them on a 911 call talking to the dispatcher, describing the brutal violence between their parents and describing it in an almost monotone fashion, as if this is as common as watching a cartoon on television, because in their life, that has become the norm.
We also know that the violence affects the kids in the home. Oftentimes people think, well, if I have a 12-year-old and a 1-year-old, the violence affects the 12-year-old greater than it affects the 1-year-old, because the 1-year-old doesn't understand everything. What you don't realize, it actually affects the younger the child, the more the violence affects them, because it affects their brain development. And so we know that kids that grow up in violent homes, it will follow them, and there's a legacy to that trauma.
You know, I remember one time when Gregory was 5 years old. He was 5 years old. He came up to me. I was sitting on the couch, and he gives me this really big hug. And he's like, "Mommy, do I have to hit girls?" I was like, What makes you think you have to hit girls? And he says, "Well, Daddy says I have to hit girls."
You know, they're sitting in school thinking about what's going on at home, maybe what happened last night. Maybe they're afraid to go home. Maybe they're afraid that their mother's gonna die. There's no way that those kids are concentrating in school when their brains are so consumed with the effects of these trauma experiences.
So if our kids aren't coming to school, we know that it's for a reason, and the likelihood that it has something to do with an adverse childhood experience is almost a guarantee. And what we find is that there is a lot of abuse and violence that these families are experiencing that become a major barrier. So we know we have to start at home. I think there's a phrase that Casey Gwen from the Alliance for Hope International says. He says, in America, we raise our criminals at home. And domestic violence is the root cause of most of, I believe, the criminal activity that we see here nationally in America. If we don't start taking care of our kids and protecting them and place them in a situation to grow up and serve other people in their community and treat them the way that we want to be treated, we're going to continue to see generational violence occur in our community.
From what I know, I don't think he ever experienced abuse, but he was raised by his grandparents until about the age of 13, and then he moved in with his mom and stepdad. I remember him telling me some things about his childhood, and he said he would watch his grandfather abuse his grandmother, and that there was a lot of violence in the home. And he also told me that his grandfather introduced him to pornography. And I remember feeling sorry for him in that moment. Like, that's such a sad childhood, and I can't imagine what that's like. But looking back and reflecting now, I can see that that's where his idea of men and women came from, and that there's this control and power dynamic, and the pornography of objectifying women, and that's where it all came from, was from his childhood.
Now, a lot of it is a learned behavior, right? And so if we grow up in a violent environment, whether it's at home or in our society, we're taught that violence is acceptable behavior. Now, whether you're a perpetrator or a victim, right, that can be learned, that it's okay to be violated, or it's okay to be violent too.
We know that children are deeply affected by domestic violence, and it affects them so much that it counts as one of the points that a child can accumulate in the Adverse Childhood Experiences score. And that score doesn't indicate that a child will be or won't be an abuser or a victim, but it does increase their risk for other health and social diseases and injuries that could occur to them. So being aware of that and talking about it and not being afraid to ask people if they need help and to keep the door open for them, I think is the most important thing that we can do as a nation.
Children who have multiple adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, can experience toxic stress. And toxic stress is a situation where children's fight or flight response is at an activated level all the time, which means that they're constantly producing stress hormones like cortisol. This can have severe and long-lasting effects on the development of children's brains, on their nervous and endocrine systems, and recent research is even indicating that it can impact their DNA. And these biological changes that happen in a child's body as they experience toxic stress, like witnessing intimate partner violence, can have long-lasting and lifetime effects. It can put them at increased risk for heart disease, for cancer, for depression, and for limited life opportunities. So it's really important when we know that children have witnessed intimate partner violence that we intervene quickly and effectively so that we can break the cycle of violence.
When people ask you all these questions and your story kind of changes over time, because what people don't understand is that when you experience a trauma, a lot of times, especially as a child, your body and your brain protect itself because there's certain things that you can't handle, especially when you do not have a support system. You protect yourself by forgetting. So I don't have a lot of specific details that I remember, but I remember what he did.
How someone is supposed to act when they're traumatized. And the general idea would be, well, this is somebody who is inconsolable. This is somebody who perhaps if they were up on a witness stand would just lose it, would be unable to function, would just fall apart. As opposed to somebody who maybe is composed, or maybe somebody who doesn't want to talk about what happened. Well, clearly there's something wrong with that person, the thought might be. And so there's a kind of a general sense of like how people should function, how people should act when they're in a trauma situation, and how people should act after it's occurred.
We need to be more understanding to survivors, especially the brave ones that are coming and talking about family members and the worst moments of their life. We need to be understanding and really dig into the psychology and the history of their background.
One of the days I remember how I was laying in a bed. I was by myself, alone with the abuser, and he tried to attack me one more time. But I put up the fight and I literally escaped with no clothes, nothing. I remember being in my pajamas and I just took off from the house. My family again is asking to keep it quiet. I remember that one of my relatives, she even told me that, Galina, this is your issue, not issue of your family. That's, you have this baggage and you should leave your family and just move away and let them build their own life. So she really put all the guilt on me, like it was me who was destroying our family. I want to describe this time that I was sleeping with one of my eyes open at all the time, and I was in extreme state of anxious and stress because I was afraid of abuser. How did I know that he's not going to act again at any moment?
There are people that go to war and have to be very violent, and they can come home and they suffer from PTSD. PTSD is the same type of brain trauma as family violence. So if it's true with family violence or with people that come back from war, it's true for people that are in domestic violence situations.
When we think about PTSD specifically, what does that involve? Well, it does involve experiencing a life-threatening traumatic event. That's either through the direct experience of the trauma, so perhaps a child who's been physically or sexually abused. It can also be through witnessing trauma as experienced by others. And so, for example, for a child, that might be seeing one parent physically assaulted by the other parent. PTSD is probably one of the more common trauma responses that can happen in life-threatening trauma. There are many other problems that can come up when it comes to mental health. And so if we look at different trauma responses amongst children, for example, in our child welfare system, we see substantially increased rates of not just PTSD, but also things like depression, suicidal thoughts and behaviors, substance use. Lots of different mental health problems can emerge as a result of trauma exposure. It can also be experienced by repeated exposure to traumatic material. So people who are first responders to trauma situations can actually be at risk for developing PTSD.
So with secondary trauma and people that work in this field, what happens is you're hearing story after story after story of trauma, and you're in that moment with the victim. You're reliving that moment with them, and it begins to accumulate over time. What it begins to look like is almost PTSD-like symptoms, where you're very quick to react to something. You have an exaggerated startle reflex, and you begin to have compassion fatigue, where you no longer have space to hear other people's story, or you come home and you don't have patience for your family.
Working with survivors, I think the most important thing that we can do for them is validate what they've gone through and listen. Most survivors don't have the opportunity to tell people what they've experienced in a way that can be comprehended in a helpful way. And so when we think about what the best thing is we can do for survivors is listen, educate, and provide as much feedback to them as possible about what their options are. They've already experienced abuse. They know what that life is like. And the worst thing that we could do is put them in a situation to feel judged or blamed or feel powerless.
One of the greatest systemic challenges facing victims of domestic violence who present to hospitals is the lack of medical providers that actually specialize in domestic violence. As I sit here, there are level 1 and 2 trauma centers in the United States, places where they can treat a shotgun wound to the chest or put pieces of somebody's skull back together after it's been bashed in, or keep somebody alive on a ventilator for days, months, or weeks. Yet these very centers are transferring out patients who present for domestic violence. I can count on this hand the number of physicians in California that specialize in domestic violence. We'll let that sit in the air for a minute. California is the largest state in the United States. It's the 4th largest economy in the world, arguably one of the most advanced medical places in the country. Yet, this is how many physicians specialize in domestic violence across the state. There's a term we use, a few of us have coined in the industry to describe this incredible health disparity amongst hospitals and trauma centers. And for those of us that work in this industry and know this, we call it the trauma center rape DV loophole. We can change the system to provide better access to care for our patients. The first being requiring level 1, 2 trauma centers to have staff trained in-house, medical providers who are able to care for these patients when they present, who are able to provide medical care while still collecting evidence and not destroying that evidence in providing that treatment. So if you've experienced trauma, there's that acute episode, right? There is, and it could be brief or it could last many years, right? But there's the beginning and the end. Afterwards, that trauma can have a powerful lingering effect on your mind. And so first steps, get the medical care you need, get that forensic care, especially if you're able to, and get your injuries treated. But secondly, you need to also treat that lingering trauma, because if you don't, it can actually lead to health deficits. It can actually cause health problems if you just let that lingering trauma last. The first step is acknowledging you've experienced both physical and mental trauma. The next step forward is finding your personal path towards healing.
I think healing comes in stages. You can only do so much at a time. So first you just heal a tiny bit, and then you heal more over years. And it's only until, I feel like until you are in a really safe place, will your spiritual self or your emotions be able to feel safe enough to heal, to open up and allow yourself to cry.
When a trauma event happens, the first step for someone, ideally, is recognizing what just happened. And that is a highly complicated piece. The idea that an event occurred and you are now moved from a place where you were not traumatized into a place where you did experience trauma it's a huge journey for an individual. And recognizing that journey, it's not often step 1, step 2. It's not often that huge change like that. It can be subtle. It can be slow and ongoing. It can be very complicated. It can be tied up in relationships. It can be tied up in feelings of love, of belonging, of duty, of holding, and the idea that an event or series of events constitute abuse, just to wrap one's head around that fact is the first part. Once the recognition happens, then another very complex part happens, is reaching out, is talking to other individuals, acknowledging what had actually occurred to yourself, and beginning, and in some ways, starting to identify as what ultimately will be a survivor of this particular event. Now, again, there are cultural pressures that keep individuals within a relationship. There are cultural aspects, familial aspects that say a marriage, for instance, is a marriage, and it's never to be broken, work it out. This holding. There is perhaps financial pressures. Perhaps there's a financial dependency on the individual who is the abuser. What happens when that goes away? What happens to dependents? What happens to children? What happens to perhaps another family member or loved one that's being supported by this financial stream that comes through? Is it worth destroying this to have my freedom or remove myself from the situation? And then there's the idea of people just like, this is how someone behaves in a relationship like this. And frankly, you don't behave that way. And so in this situation, this pushback for someone who has identified, or at least is playing with the idea of identifying this relationship as one of abuse, of violence, may get pushed back by those individuals who say, this is how you should be acting in this scenario, and you're not. And so they're looking towards others to reflect back the reality of what's actually happening, and they're not seeing it. They're seeing a normal person who is not in a domestic violence situation in the reflection of those looking back at them. And so they, in a very difficult kind of a way, may reinforce their own sense that they're to blame for this relationship to begin with. And that's reinforced. And so maybe the abuser is saying, it's your fault that I'm doing this. And then they look towards support outwards and they're like, maybe it's your fault you're doing this. And then that's the help. And so then it rolls back in. So all of these consequences that people on the outside looking in may truly just not understand, but also don't necessarily want to understand. And so now that the acknowledgement happens, then the planning begins. And then the planning can be highly complex. How do you disconnect a life from somebody that may be so infused in their life that to extricate oneself from it will be traumatic in itself? And so that extrication that happens and the societal pressures can push somebody right back in as well. But as the movement happens, then with the help, ideally, with the help of other individuals who understand this pattern and the pressures that can occur, this help of removing oneself safely can occur. And I think that's one of the things that I want to emphasize is handling this on one's own is really very difficult. And individuals in these relationships, in these experiences, you're not alone. They're not alone. There are people out there that want to help, and they're deserving of good lives, of lives without the fear of being harmed. And it's not just the physical piece, right? Bruising is one thing, physical thing, but there's the emotional content. And that, again, the bruising of the soul, of the spirit, of the emotion can be as hard as anything else. And then there's a whole rebuilding phase that has to occur. What happened? Will it happen again? What are the patterns that are happening? How did it happen in the first place? This whole huge, very complex, difficult examination of one's own self and what happened. But then also, what's going on with this other person? I think a lot of society loves to look at the victim or the survivor and why did that happen? But the focus being on the abuser, why is that happening? I think that the attention can very much be on a sense of weakness, a sense of like, I would never allow myself to be in that situation. And then the abuser kind of gets pushed to the side, right? Or alternatively, if we're looking at that societal holding piece, the abuser is a monster. The abuser is a monster, and it helps us feel better that we would identify a monster from a mile away. But then this rebuilding of a life and how that looks is that next phase. And as movement happens, there may be backtrack, there may be emotional components, there are physical components, just a sense of how someone functions and their own identity They're being explored in that phase, and this kind of rebuilding of oneself outside of the relationship, or in spite of, or in building on top of that relationship.
As a child, I wanted a superhero to come rescue me. I wanted somebody to come and tell me that everything was going to be okay and take me away from my abusers. What I didn't realize is the superhero was inside me. I was the superhero. I just didn't know it yet. And I became that superhero because I fought back. I didn't ask for this. I didn't want to be a rape victim and a rape survivor and a rape thriver. I didn't want this life, but it was given to me and I had a choice whether I was going to stay a victim or whether I was going to grow up and become a superhero.